Emma and her boyfriend Mark found themselves in the heart of a sprawling forest. Not far from Mark's house, the sun had long since set, and the forest had fallen into darkness. It was almost midnight, and the nearest trail was a 5 to 7 minute walk over rough terrain. They were sure they were alone in this secluded corner of the wilderness. Enveloped in the night air, Emma and Mark walked through the forest hand in hand, with only the quiet rustling of leaves underfoot breaking the silence. The faint silvery light of the moon filtered through the thick canopy, casting eerie shadows. After getting lost in the beauty of the night, they decided to stop and enjoy the silence. They found a small clearing and sat down on it, their laughter mingling with the distant hooting of an owl. Their kisses were sweet and long, a testament to their deep love. But then something changed. Mark, who had a heightened sense of awareness, felt alarmed. He gazed into the darkness, straining his eyes to make out something behind the trees. A shadow, a fleeting glimpse, caught his attention. It moved stealthily, about 20 to 25 feet to their left, coming up toward them. Mark's heart racing, he nudged Emma, whispering urgently, "Emma, did you see that? I think there's someone there." Emma, startled, turned her gaze in the same direction. She could barely make out a silhouette, but it was enough to send shivers running down her spine. Sensing they were being watched, the shadow stopped abruptly, and a chill settled in the air. Mark squeezed Emma's hand tighter and whispered again, "Stay alert, something's wrong." They watched in horror as a figure emerged from the darkness, moving with deliberate, eerie grace. It seemed as if the intruder was trying to walk right over them. Panic froze in their veins, and they stayed still, hidden in the thicket, keeping their eyes on the approaching stranger. The figure continued to move forward, closing the horizontal gap between them and the pair. With each step, his heart pounded louder and louder, adrenaline surging in his blood. 15 feet separated them now, breaking through the dense thicket of trees. The ominous stranger was almost beside them. Without hesitation, Mark made an instant decision. He gripped Emma's hand tightly, and the two of them darted away. They dashed down the steep slope, their feet sliding through mud and leaves, desperately trying to keep their balance. Leaves and branches crackled beneath their feet, creating a cacophony that seemed deafening in the silence of the night. A dark figure, startled by their sudden movement, hesitated briefly before darting off in pursuit. Their footsteps were muffled by the pounding of their hearts as they raced across the rugged terrain. Mark's voice nudged Emma forward, his grip unwavering. In less than 2 minutes they reached the safety of the trail, panting but not letting go of each other's hands. The ominous sound of an approaching pursuer could be heard behind them. They ran down the winding path as fast as they could. Eventually the forest changed to a more familiar scene, filled with the warm glow of civilization. At the edge of the forest stood a cafe, lit by a soft, inviting light. Behind it were basketball and tennis courts, and next to a wooded hill crowded with people enjoying a night out. Emma and Mark peered into the cafe and for a moment went unnoticed. They looked back towards the forest, their hearts still pounding with fear. The dark figure did not pursue them in the open, but disappeared into the forest shroud. Gasping, Emma and Mark clung to each other, grateful that they had managed to escape. A realization came over them of the harsh reality of what had almost happened. They had come very close to a dangerous encounter. Taking a breath and looking back at the safe, noisy world outside the forest, Emma and Mark silently swore. Never again would they go into this forest at night. At about 10:11 p.m., the Australian bush was a dark and mysterious place. Jake, an experienced leader, was leading a convoy of about 60 cadets. They walked along a winding trail, shrouded in the night's haze. Light discipline was strictly enforced, and only 2 men had flashlights. Jake walked in front and the other squad leader in the rear. There were 2 reasons for this arrangement. First, it allowed them to remain visible to all passing vehicles on the trail. Second, it allowed most of the cadets to preserve their precious night vision. Dressed in camouflage, they were ghosts in the dark, almost invisible. As they moved forward, Jake's keen eyes occasionally scanned their surroundings. Something unusual caught his eye. There were small glittering droplets scattered on the ground, like tiny glowing blue gems. This curious sight piqued his interest, but he couldn't explore further without breaking formation. After a while, the group decided to take a short break. This respite gave Jake the perfect opportunity to satisfy his curiosity. He stepped quietly off the trail, guided by flashlight, determined to get a closer look at these unusual dewdrops. As he approached, he expected to find a natural phenomenon, but perhaps bioluminescent insects or plants native to the Australian bush. What he encountered, however, turned out to be far from pleasant. As soon as the light fell on the supposed dewdrops, he was greeted by a sight that sent shivers running down his spine. Instead of sparkling gems or dewdrops, he found himself face to face with a group of large spiders. These huntsman-like spiders were unnaturally massive, each the size of the palm of a grown man's hand. They sat in the thicket, their glittering eyes reflecting the hard beam of Jake's headlamp. When he swung the flashlight around, the horrifying truth became clear. There were thousands of these monstrous arachnids all around him. They covered the ground in an eerie, undulating carpet, clinging to tree trunks, hiding in the shadows, all focused on the beacon of light attached to his head. In that instant, Jake felt a rush of terror like he'd never felt before. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, his heart pounding in his chest. Panic seized Jake, and he realized he had to get back to safety, regardless of the rules of discipline. On trembling legs, he strode briskly back, his composure hanging by a thread. The scream that had been building up inside him finally came out, echoing through the night city and sending shivers down the spines of his fellow cadets. Jake, being an arachnophobe, couldn't understand how he'd gotten up the courage to pitch a tent and spend the next week in that creepy, spider-infested forest. In the heart of Kenya, where the vast African desert stretched in all directions, Edward and his friends set out on an extraordinary adventure in the fresh fall air. Their mission took them to this remote corner of the planet, and as the sun dipped below the horizon, they settled down for the night under a glittering canopy of stars. Their dwelling was far from luxurious. Thin sleeping bags were spread out on the ground, forming a makeshift and hastily constructed triangle. The group huddled together, seeking warmth and comfort in the cool African night. This was an experience that would test their resilience and courage. As they lay there, Edward and his friends began to notice something disturbing. A feeling that they were being watched stirred in the back of their heads. Their trained instincts told them that they were not alone. Faint sounds of movement in the distance hinted at the presence of someone lurking in the shadows. Whispers spread through the group as they speculated on who their night watchers were. Hyenas, they guessed, judging from the eerie laughter that echoed in the darkness. The sound sent shivers down their spines. To keep themselves safe, two of the group volunteered to be on duty all night, taking turns checking the perimeter with flashlights. Rays of light darted across the African landscape. But time passed, and fatigue began to take its toll. The African wilderness was inexorable, and sleep beckoned with irresistible force. One of the observers, a man named Mark, struggled to stay awake. His eyelids grew heavy and fatigue clouded his judgment. The other observer, unbeknownst to Mark, was distracted by the distant calls of wild animals, and his flashlight wavered as he focused on something outside their camp. It was a perfect storm of circumstance, a brief letdown of vigilance. Just when the stars were shining brightest and the world seemed the quietest, the unthinkable happened. The ominous presence they had sensed earlier, the elusive night watchers, manifested itself with chilling insolence. A hyena, its eyes glittering with unearthly hunger, approached the camp with graceful grace. A keen sniff caught the scent of potential prey and picked out the most vulnerable member of the group. It was Edward's buddy, David. With silent precision, the hyena caught up with the unsuspecting man. Its powerful jaws clawed at the bottom of David's sleeping bag, its sharp teeth ripping through the fabric. The sudden horrifying reality struck David like a lightning strike. He was being dragged into the impenetrable blackness of the African night. David's initial shock turned to terror and he let out a piercing scream that pierced the silence of the night. His friends awoke to the nightmarish scene unfolding before them, and their flashlights highlighted the nightmarish struggle between man and beast. There was a deafening noise, and the camp became chaos as everyone jumped to their feet, shouting and waving their makeshift weapons. The hyena, frightened by the sudden attack, loosened its grip and retreated into the shadows. Gasping and wide-eyed, David remained lying on the ground, his heart pounding furiously. The adrenaline frenzy that followed ensured that the hyenas would not return that night. Fires were lit. The group huddled together for shelter and recounted the horrific incident over and over again. The stars overhead lost their brilliance and the serene beauty of the African desert was overshadowed by fear. In the days that followed, the group remained on high alert. Every rustle in the bush, every distant cry of a wild animal sent shivers down their spines. They redoubled their efforts to protect the camp, fortifying the makeshift defenses with thorns and sticks. Despite the lingering sense of unease, Edward and his friends continued their mission in Kenya. They delved deeper into the wilderness, and every step they took was a testament to their resilience and determination. Isaac and his girlfriend Emily decided to take a leisurely stroll along the abandoned railroad bed that ran through the dense forest near their small picturesque town of Cedarwood. It was a crisp fall afternoon, and fallen leaves crunched beneath their feet as they walked hand in hand. The railroad tracks had long been abandoned, and the once vibrant lifeline of the town was now reclaimed by nature. Trees sprouted between the tracks, and old rusty rail cars stood silently, covered in graffiti and moss. As they continued on their way, Emily's playful spirit took over. "Let's see what's under that bridge," she suggested with a mischievous twinkle in her eye, pointing to a small dilapidated bridge spanning a narrow creek. Isaac, always up for an adventure, grinned and agreed. They descended the embankment and headed toward the bridge. The sound of the flowing water grew louder as they approached. The creek, though small, seemed to hold secrets. As they approached the bridge, Emily froze. Her finger trembled, pointing at something lurking in the woods across the way. Isaac followed her gaze and squinted, trying to make out a figure among the trees. "I see him too," Isaac whispered, his heartbeat quickening. The figure was hidden by the foliage, but they could make out the outline of a man. Not wanting to alarm Emily, Isaac decided to keep a low profile. He continued walking toward the creek, pretending that nothing unusual was happening. The stranger was still quite far away, and he hoped they would pass unnoticed. But as they approached the bank of the creek, the stranger suddenly stood up, revealing them to their view. Isaac's stomach rumbled as the strange sight added to his initial fear. The man was completely naked, even though it was fall and the weather was far from warm. The stranger didn't seem at all bothered by the cold air. His disheveled hair and wild eyes sent shivers down Isaac's spine. Emily clutched at Isaac's arm, her wide-open eyes staring at the stranger in disbelief. For a moment, it seemed as if time had stopped. Thoughts raced through Isaac's mind, trying to make sense of this surreal encounter. Why was this man out here, naked, in the middle of the woods? What could he possibly want? They didn't wait for an answer. Fear bubbled in their veins and their survival instincts kicked in. Without a word, Isaac and Emily turned on their heels and raced back toward the embankment, their footsteps echoing off the worn logs of the bridge. Their hearts pounded in their chests as they scrambled up the steep slope, their breath coming out in convulsive gasps. Panic gripped them as they ran from the strange, naked man. They didn't know if he was following them and didn't dare look back. After what seemed like an eternity, they popped back out onto the abandoned railroad bed and relief came over them. They slowed their step, panting, and finally allowed themselves to look back. The track was empty, and the strange stranger was nowhere to be seen. As they walked further down the path, their fear began to subside, replaced by curiosity mixed with terror. Isaac couldn't shake the feeling that they had stumbled upon something inexplicable, unfathomable. After about a minute, Isaac couldn't resist the urge to look back once more. What he saw made him freeze in place. There, in the middle of the railroad tracks they had just stepped off of, stood a naked man. He stood motionless and stared at them with anxious tension. Isaac's heart pounded with renewed vigor as he turned away from the gruesome sight, urging Emily to move on. He realized that they needed to get as far away from the stranger as possible. The leisurely walk had turned into a surreal nightmare, and they couldn't shake the feeling that they had stumbled upon something they weren't meant to witness. Once out of the dense forest and back into the familiar surroundings of Cedarwood, Isaac and Emily vowed never to return to the abandoned railroad tracks again. In the heart of the small, picturesque town of Willowbrook, nestled on the edge of a dense forest, there was a sense of tranquility. Here neighbors knew each other by name, and the woods were the site of countless childhood adventures. One cool fall afternoon, as the leaves colored the landscape in bright shades of red and gold, Adam and his friend Brian decided to explore the forest. They had known each other since kindergarten and had always enjoyed spending time together. The friends set off deep into the forest, their footsteps softened by a thick layer of fallen leaves as they walked along the winding path. The only companions were the rustling of leaves and the chirping of birds. It was during this serene walk that something unusual caught their attention. Among the trees they noticed a dog walking cautiously with its tail tucked. Its appearance was in stark contrast to its serene surroundings, and its anxious behavior was impossible to miss. Adam and Brian exchanged perplexed glances and decided to approach the dog. Not immediately they realized that they were not alone in their pursuit. Following the dog at some distance was a small boy, no older than 10, who looked worried and ready to cry. Concerned for the child's well-being, Adam and Brian cautiously approached him. "Hey, buddy, you all right?" asked Adam, crouching down beside the boy. The boy wheezed, his eyes red with tears. "No," he answered quietly. "I was supposed to be looking after my friend's dog and he ran away from me. I can't find him and I don't know what to do." Adam and Brian exchanged sympathetic glances, after which Brian added, "Don't worry. We'll help you find your friend's dog." "What's the dog's name?" The boy brushed away a tear and wheezed again. "His name is Max." With a newfound sense of purpose, the trio set off in search of Max. For the next hour, they followed the restless dog deeper into the woods. As they moved away from the familiar trail, the forest seemed to close in around them, and the trees cast long, eerie shadows. Max's behavior became more and more erratic as he darted through the thicket and dodged their attempts to get closer. The dog was still without a collar, making it impossible to secure him. Frustration could be heard in their voices as they discussed next steps. "We should try baiting him with some food," Brian suggested and reached into his backpack for a snack. Just as they were discussing their plan, a sudden rustle in the bushes behind them made Adam and Brian turn around, their hearts racing. But there was nothing there, just the whisper of the wind among the trees. Pushing aside their alarm, they turned back to Max, but found that the spot where the dog had been a few minutes ago was empty. In a panic, they looked around, but neither the dog nor the boy was in sight. "What just happened?" Adam exclaimed, his voice shaking. Brian's eyes darted round, looking for any sign of them. "I don't know, but we have to find them. They can't have gotten far." They began calling for the boy and the dog, their voices echoing through the silent forest. The minutes passed, and the sun was sinking lower and lower. Strangely, there was no answer, no children's laughter, no dogs barking. Only an eerie silence that seemed to envelop the forest like a shroud. Adam's heart pounded in his chest as he surveyed the forest floor. It was covered in a thick layer of fallen leaves, perfect for preserving tracks. But not a single footprint could be found. Not even the slightest rustle could be heard, even though the ground was covered with fallen leaves. Max and the boy seemed to disappear into thin air.